Kant and reason. Before we begin, it's important to note that the concept of reason in Kant's philosophy plays a fundamental role in the project that his entire philosophy is directed towards. To know reason, to set limits on it, and to restructure it in a way that guides action. These are the things that this role needs to do. And that's why it also brings about the action of reason knowing its own limits and creating new ones. In this context, in this episode, after generally explaining what reason is, we will provide a more detailed explanation of its two basic uses, theoretical and practical. Reason as the faculty of faculties. To define Kant's reason requires understanding the perspective of a modern-day philosopher. The fact that reason, when engaged in metaphysics, oversteps its boundaries leads him to approach said reason critically. Kant's concept of criticality tries to emphasize this. For this reason, criticality exhibits a negative attitude, even if it has positive outcomes. In a way, just like medicine heals even if it's bitter, so is the criticism of reason. Besides this, understanding the reason that carries out Kant's act of critique is more important, and ultimately this is the reason that Kant places in a superior position. Parallel to the approach we described above, Kant defines this general reason as the faculty aimed at producing a priori knowledge. However, under this general faculty, it's necessary to understand what the actual workers are. In this context, reason can be thought of as an institution that possesses the sum of knowledge produced by these faculties. Just as an institution consists of various divisions of labor, reason also consists of various parts. However, reason itself represents more than the sum of its parts. We can understand this in a way as it being more than the sum of all its parts. When trying to understand Kant, we have to pay attention to his rationality, which addresses, in other words, critiques reason. We should also remember that this understanding emerges as transcendental reason. We can say that Kant grappled with metaphysical thought, which we can describe as the dogmatic history of reason, to reach this critical level. Therefore, besides a reason that is historically the sum of the past, we should also consider the reason that Kant presents both theoretically and practically, as we will explain below. Theoretical reason. The theoretical is the reason directed towards knowing. According to Kant, thinking holds a significant place in reason's pursuit of knowledge, and of course, in the act of acquiring knowledge that needs to be evaluated in this regard. Although thinking operates with concepts, the function of these concepts emerges depending on the material coming from sensory data. Therefore, Kant believes that a distinction must be made between thinking, that is, the existence of concepts within the internal workings of reason, and their use. In other words, thinking and knowing are distinct acts of reason. The point that Kant will try to put forward is that reason, which does not make this distinction, imposes necessity on its own concepts. This necessity is the necessity in thinking. It does not correspond to a state that we can express as reality. Therefore, it is not possible to say that they are true, and based on this truth, to say that they are knowledge about existence, that is, reality. According to Kant, the critique of pure reason is to judge reason's own claims and capabilities within the framework of its own rules. The critique of pure reason is not a critique of a book or a system. Rather, it is to decide by determining the possibility of knowledge independently of experience. In this sense, the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics, its dimensions, sources, and limits. Kant does not underestimate the importance of concepts in thinking. On the contrary, according to Kant, thinking is only an activity carried out with concepts. Besides, concepts are clothes that we put on sensory data. In the end, his criticality will not be aimed at eliminating concepts. Kant will give unchangeable importance to these concepts by calling them forms of judgment. However, he will not fall into the error of seeing reason's own concepts as the actual reality, as rationalists do. Therefore, it is necessary to address reason's claim to knowledge in a theoretical sense in a different way. Kant briefly states that the meaningfulness of concepts can be mentioned in the sense that they give form to the material coming from sensory data, as we mentioned above. The point to note is that although the realm of experience, that is, the realm filled with sensory data, shows us what something is, what is actually sought is why it must necessarily be so. This fundamental search for necessity lies behind our knowing things in science, behind our transforming our assumptions into theory and law. This is where we can say that Kant proposes that both sensory data and reason become partners. This partnership for Kant is a sign of an action that he thinks reason applies in all theoretical operations. This action for Kant is synthesis or unification. It is important to remember that unification will occur not only when there is thinking, but also when there is sensing. In this context, we need to say that knowing occurs as a result of concepts being thought about, even though they are subject to the senses. Kant's famous statement, which we mentioned above to emphasize this situation, that is, the importance of this relationship between thinking and sensation, is this: intuition without concepts is blind. Concepts without intuition are empty. Intuition is a concept that we will discuss in detail later. However, for the sake of explaining the famous quote above, let's state that for now, it will suffice to understand intuition as a concept related only to sensory data. Another important point is that the knowledge that Kant considers in the theoretical sense should be compatible with the structure and results of modern science. Therefore, we should know that the teleological understanding of science, which should be evaluated as a result of the understanding of nature in antiquity, is subject to Kant's criticism. Kant does not oppose this teleology. However, he thinks that teleology, at least in the modern sense, cannot be reconciled with the structure revealed by science. Therefore, Kant will state that such concepts are used incorrectly in actions aimed at knowing within reason. This error is inevitable, but it will be possible to understand that it is wrong precisely when it is revealed critically. Later, we will theoretically determine the right and wrong aspects of knowing. What we need to understand is that thinking nourished by the senses is correct. Kant states that otherwise reason's thinking within itself will serve no purpose other than turning into a battlefield called metaphysics. We mentioned that the theoretical use of reason is directed towards knowing. As we know, our minds do not only operate towards knowing, therefore there must also be a realm where feelings and desires exist. Rationality here will not be about controlling the senses, but about controlling feelings, values, and actions. So when we say practical reason, it will be necessary to understand a structure that, in its own way, should not take control for knowing, but for action. The point that needs to be added as a note here is that it's not about being against feelings themselves, but about not letting oneself get carried away by them. Also, respect, which we will later see as a sense of reason, is considered very important by Kant. Just as there are various fundamental concepts, that is, categories, in theoretical reason, practical reason will also have its own specific fundamental concepts. It is important to note that these concepts are in the form of laws. In a way, the fact that concepts are in the form of laws is also beneficial for revealing that there is a different functioning of reason in the theoretical sense and in the practical sense. To better explain this situation, it is necessary to understand that law actually points to a structure that must be obeyed. Morally, something needs to be done. This necessity is reinforced and transformed into an obligation by Kant, with concepts such as duty, responsibility, and respect. But unlike the necessity that should exist in nature, here there is a necessity that should be done. Thus, the understanding that needs to be addressed within the framework of practical reason expresses itself as, why do I have to act like this? Kant will argue that this structure leads us to the fundamental principles of moral law. Another important point to note is where the concept of freedom stands under this legal obligation. At first glance, freedom seems to involve freedom of action. However, under moral law, freedom transforms man into the necessity of acting in a certain direction. Kant will use the concept of duty instead of the virtue of the moral person to express this necessity. In other words, filling my freedom in a way that will lead to a good action is nothing more than a duty of myself, of my moral character, something that it should normally do. Kant sees this in a way as a natural progression that should happen for a person to reach maturity as a human being. The difference is that this necessity will only make sense if it is done by a human being. Thus, Kant does not want to draw a boundary in the realm of practical reason as he does in the theoretical realm. To put it differently, the limitlessness within the freedom of doing what I want here is desired to be limited. However, it is necessary to take into account that the actual form of acting has a structure that advances, not pulls back, a person in terms of pointing to what a person needs to do. It would be appropriate to understand his contribution to the idea of progress in enlightenment in this context. The distinction between theoretical and practical reason points to their difference, not their lack of relationship. In other words, it is necessary to state that there is a bridge established by Kant between the two structures of reason, and that some concepts pass through this bridge from the theoretical to the practical side and settle there. These concepts are God, freedom, and immortality. In fact, these concepts have wanted to establish themselves, at least within philosophical thought, in the theoretical realm. However, as a result of this desire, Kant states that a war called metaphysics has taken place in the history of thought. Therefore, Kant thinks that the concepts in question should move to the practical realm and be established there. In this episode, we made a general introduction to Kant's philosophy. In this sense, we tried to show how he evaluates reason to ensure its integrity. We pointed out that this approach generally takes the form of criticality. In the following episodes, we tried to explain what the theoretical and practical use of reason means. We touched upon some fundamental concepts in this separate but related structure. It should not be forgotten that Kant, while separating reason into theoretical and practical, tries to unite rather than fragment it.